The judge smirked when a black man walked into court alone. No lawyer, no fancy suit, just a folder in his hand. Everyone thought he'd lose. But when he opened his mouth, the entire courtroom went silent. What he said next didn't just stop the eviction. It exposed the system. This isn't just a story about law. It's about justice, dignity, and a father who refused to be broken. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet chatter, the kind of background noise that fills the air when people are bored, waiting for the next case to start. A bailiff stood off to the side, checking his clipboard. Lawyers shuffled papers and clicked pens. The judge sat back in his chair, checking his watch, already assuming the next case would be another open and shut eviction ruling. Then the double doors at the back creaked open. Every head turned. A tall, lean black man walked in. His clothes weren't new. His dress shirt was clean, but slightly wrinkled. His shoes looked worn, and he carried no briefcase, only a simple brown folder tucked under one arm. There was something about his walk. Not nervous, but not confident either. Just calm, focused, determined. As he approached the defendant's table, people started whispering. That's the guy. He doesn't have a lawyer. Man, this is going to be quick. Even the judge looked amused. He raised an eyebrow and peered over his glasses. Mr. Carter, I assume you're the defendant in this matter? Yes, Your Honor, the man replied, his voice calm but clear. And are you representing yourself today? Yes, Your Honor. The judge gave a half smile, one of those polite but doubtful kinds of smiles. He wasn't trying to be cruel, but the expression on his face said it all. He'd seen this before. A tenant down on his luck, no money for legal help, trying to talk his way out of an eviction. 9 times out of 10, it didn't end well. Someone in the back actually laughed under their breath. The opposing party, a high-end landlord in a navy blue suit, sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 attorneys. They looked over at Jamal Carter like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. To them, this was routine. Just another case. Just another poor tenant with no clue what he was doing. But what they didn't know was that Jamal had spent the last 3 months preparing for this exact moment. They didn't know about the nights he'd stayed up past midnight after putting his daughter to sleep. They didn't know about the hours he spent in the public library, reading state housing laws and watching trial footage on YouTube. They didn't know how many free PDFs, legal forums, and bar association guides he'd poured through just to understand how the system worked. And they definitely didn't know that Jamal Carter had once dreamed of being a lawyer, before life had thrown him curveball after curveball, forcing him to put his dreams aside to raise his daughter alone. So, no, this wasn't just another case to him. This was a battle for his home, his dignity, and his little girl's future. As the judge began going over the paperwork, Jamal took a deep breath and looked around the courtroom. He saw the smirks, the judgment in their eyes. But he didn't flinch. He wasn't here to impress them. He was here to prove something, to the court, to the landlord, and to himself. Let's begin, the judge finally said, tapping his gavel. This is case number 32894. Plaintiff, Mr. Samuel Green, is seeking eviction of the tenant, Mr. Jamal Carter, for non-payment of rent. Mr. Carter is self-represented. Mr. Green is represented by legal counsel. Mr. Carter, do you have any preliminary statements before we proceed to evidence? Jamal stood up. He didn't look at the plaintiff. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight at the judge. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to begin by entering my defense, which includes multiple housing code violations, proof of retaliatory threats from the landlord, and a motion to dismiss the eviction based on unlawful notice timing, in violation of state tenant law. The courtroom went silent. Even the judge's expression changed. His smirk was gone. The bailiff looked up from his clipboard. The plaintiff's attorney stopped writing. The landlord's mouth dropped open just a bit. Jamal opened his folder slowly and deliberately and pulled out several neatly stacked documents. And just like that, the mood in the courtroom shifted. The man they had underestimated had just taken control. 3 months before he walked into that courtroom, Jamal Carter was sitting at his kitchen table with his head in his hands, staring at a piece of paper taped to his front door. The word notice was printed in bold red letters across the top. His stomach sank the moment he saw it. Eviction. He didn't even need to read the rest of it. He already knew what it meant. He and his 6-year-old daughter, Nia, had 30 days to get out. No appeals, no negotiation, just gone. Jamal had been struggling ever since his job at the auto parts factory was eliminated during a company merger. He was a dependable worker, never missed a shift, always showed up early, but none of that mattered when the new owners came in. They laid off a dozen people in one day. Jamal was one of them. Since then, he'd been doing everything he could, delivering food at night, fixing cars out of his garage, even helping people move on the weekends. But none of it was enough to keep up with the rising rent in the neighborhood. He paid what he could, but his landlord, Samuel Green, didn't care about excuses. Green was one of those landlords who saw people like Jamal as numbers, not as human beings. Jamal called around, trying to get legal help. He spent hours on the phone with legal aid, waiting on hold, only to be told they were too backed up. He contacted several lawyers, but the cheapest consultation started at $150, money he didn't have. At one point, he even considered giving up and moving into a friend's cramped basement with Nia, just to avoid homelessness. But something inside him wouldn't let go. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was his daughter, watching him with wide, innocent eyes, asking, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" He couldn't look her in the eyes and say, "I gave up." So instead, he got to work. Late at night, after putting Nia to bed, Jamal pulled out an old laptop he'd borrowed from a neighbor and connected it to the free Wi-Fi outside the local coffee shop. He bundled up in a hoodie, sat in his beat-up car, and typed in, "How to fight an eviction without a lawyer." That one search led him down a rabbit hole. At first, it was just articles and blog posts. Then came legal PDFs. Then YouTube videos from attorneys who offered free advice. He discovered a subreddit where tenants shared their experiences in court and how they'd stood up to slumlords. Jamal started printing pages of legal code from the public library. He organized them into folders. He made notes, highlighted sections, and built outlines. He even created his own calendar of deadlines for filing motions and responses. He wasn't just reading, he was studying. In one YouTube video, a housing rights advocate said something that stuck with him. Landlords count on tenants being uneducated. The minute you start speaking their language, everything changes. That was the moment Jamal decided he wouldn't just defend himself. He'd fight back. He learned about the implied warranty of habitability, a law that requires landlords to maintain livable conditions. Jamal had photos of mold in the bathroom and a leaking pipe in the kitchen that hadn't been fixed in 6 months, despite multiple maintenance requests. He studied the state's tenant eviction procedures, learning that his landlord had failed to give the proper written notice timeline. In fact, the notice Jamal received violated the legal process completely. Then, to top it off, he discovered something shocking. The building had been flagged by the city inspector 2 years ago for violations that had never been resolved. The report was still public record. That's when it clicked. He had more than a defense, he had a case. Over the next few weeks, Jamal built a binder of evidence. Timestamps of maintenance requests, emails to the landlord, city reports, photographs, and printed text messages. He even interviewed his neighbors and collected written statements about similar issues in the building. By the time his court date arrived, he didn't just feel ready, he felt powerful. Not because he was a lawyer, but because he knew his rights. And when he walked into that courtroom alone, with nothing but his folder and his determination, he didn't see himself as a poor black man trying to survive. He saw himself as a father fighting for his child, a citizen demanding justice, a man who refused to be pushed aside by a system that expected him to be silent. They saw nobody walking in. But Jamal? He was walking in like somebody who knew exactly what he was doing. When Jamal Carter stood to speak, the entire courtroom expected a stumbling mess. A few legal buzzwords, maybe a plea for sympathy, followed by the judge banging the gavel and granting the eviction. Instead, the air shifted the moment Jamal opened his mouth. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and respectful. "I move to dismiss this eviction based on multiple violations of the state's housing code, failure to provide legal notice under proper statute, and evidence of landlord retaliation following a documented complaint to the city housing department." The words came out crisp and clear, like someone who had been in a courtroom a dozen times before. For a moment, no one spoke. The judge looked over the rim of his glasses and sat a little straighter in his seat. The landlord's lawyers stopped scribbling and exchanged puzzled glances. You could feel the shift. This wasn't the unprepared defendant they had expected. Jamal walked to the clerk's desk and respectfully handed over a neatly organized set of documents. Inside, photos of his apartment's cracked ceilings, a bathroom riddled with black mold, broken light fixtures, and exposed wires near his daughter's bedroom. He had time-stamped maintenance requests. He had emails and letters where the landlord had ignored repeated complaints. He even included a full copy of the city inspection report from 2 years ago that showed multiple violations the landlord never corrected. Exhibit, Jamal said calmly, as if he'd done this 100 times. The judge reviewed the documents, flipping through them slowly. His face, which had been casual and almost amused at the start of the session, turned serious. This wasn't just a tenant who missed rent. This was a tenant who had been ignored, mistreated, and potentially endangered, especially with a young child living in those conditions. Jamal continued. According to Section 1942 of the State Civil Code, tenants have the right to withhold rent in cases where the property is deemed uninhabitable and the landlord fails to make timely repairs. I attempted communication multiple times with no response. I also documented my concerns with the City Housing Authority, which is when I began receiving texts from Mr. Green pressuring me to vacate early. He handed over screenshots of those messages. The judge raised his eyebrows. That last part wasn't just a housing code issue. It bordered on intimidation. The plaintiff's lead attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, while Mr. Carter is obviously passionate, he is not a trained lawyer. We believe this presentation is more emotional than factual and respectfully request the court to proceed with the eviction. But before the judge could respond, Jamal did something no one expected. He stayed calm. He didn't get defensive. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he walked back to his table, pulled out a second folder, and said, I anticipated that objection, but I also anticipated that passion alone wouldn't win this case. That's why everything I've presented is backed by law, case precedent, and evidence. He then cited 3 past court cases where tenants had won similar disputes due to lack of repair, improper eviction procedures, and landlord retaliation. He had read the case files. He knew the verdicts, and he made his arguments with clarity and poise. The room fell quiet again. Even the courtroom clerk, who had seen hundreds of hearings, couldn't hide her look of surprise. She leaned over and whispered something to the bailiff, who just shook his head and muttered, Didn't see that coming. The judge held up his hand, signaling silence. Mr. Carter, he said, finally breaking the stillness, I must admit, I was not expecting this level of preparation. You've presented a compelling defense, one that the court takes very seriously. The landlord's lawyers looked uncomfortable now. What had started as a routine eviction had suddenly become a legal minefield. Their client, who had smirked just an hour earlier, was now nervously tapping his pen against the table. Jamal didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just sat back down, straightened his folders, and looked at the judge. Because he knew, this was the moment everything changed. The courtroom no longer saw him as just another tenant. They saw him as a man who did his homework, a father who refused to back down, a citizen who learned the law because no one else would fight for him. And most importantly, they saw him as credible. The judge turned to the landlord's attorneys with a completely different tone now. I will need time to review all submissions carefully. Given the thoroughness of Mr. Carter's presentation, I suggest we take a short recess. I'd also advise the plaintiff to be prepared to respond to each of these allegations with equal detail, or consider a resolution before this becomes a larger legal issue. Jamal had done the unthinkable. He hadn't just delayed an eviction. He'd turned the entire courtroom in his favor. The courtroom was no longer laughing. What had begun as a routine eviction case had now transformed into something entirely different, something unpredictable. Jamal Carter had turned the tables, and everyone felt it. His arguments had weight. His evidence was airtight. His delivery was calm, professional, and controlled. Even the judge, who at first had chuckled when Jamal said he'd represent himself, was now taking notes, flipping through the documents with care, and asking sharp questions. not to Jamal, but to the plaintiff's legal team. Mr. Green, the judge said, turning to the landlord, is it true you received these maintenance requests and failed to respond? The landlord's lawyer jumped in. Your Honor, our client disputes the timing and validity of those requests. But the judge cut him off. I'm not talking to you, counselor. I want to hear it from Mr. Green directly. The landlord looked caught off guard. Yes, I got some texts from Mr. Carter, but it's not like the issues were that serious. He was behind on rent regardless. Jamal didn't flinch. He calmly stood and replied, Your Honor, I have documentation showing that I paid partial rent in good faith and even offered to continue paying if repairs were made. I was met with silence until I contacted the city's housing inspector. 2 days later, I received this text from Mr. Green telling me to pack my stuff before things get messy. I believe that constitutes retaliatory behavior, which violates state law. He handed the judge a printed screenshot. The judge took one look and sighed. This court doesn't tolerate intimidation, Mr. Green. The room was silent again, thick with tension. Jamal's calm demeanor had become his greatest weapon. He wasn't just proving his case. He was exposing the landlord's pattern of neglect and coercion. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together, and it painted a very ugly picture for the plaintiff. The opposing attorney huddled with his colleague. They whispered for a moment. Then one of them stood and requested a private meeting with the judge. Your Honor, we'd like to approach the bench for a sidebar. The judge nodded, slightly annoyed but curious. As the attorneys and judge conferred off mic, Jamal sat still, focused. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't relaxing. He knew this wasn't over yet, but he could feel it. He had momentum on his side now. A few minutes later, the judge returned to his seat and addressed the courtroom. We will take a 15-minute recess. As people began to shift and stretch, the landlord's attorney approached Jamal. Mr. Carter, may we speak privately in the hallway? Jamal hesitated. As long as this doesn't violate court protocol. It won't. Off the record. They stepped outside, and for the first time since this legal battle began, the tone completely changed. We want to offer a settlement, the attorney said quickly. No eviction, provided that you withdraw the countersuit. In addition, our client will repair all listed damages within 30 days and offer you a 2-month rent credit. You'll remain in the apartment as a tenant in good standing. Jamal paused, arms crossed, thinking. He didn't speak for nearly a full minute. I'll agree, he said slowly. Under 3 conditions. Repairs must begin within the week. All communication must be documented in writing. And if any retaliation happens after this agreement, I retain the right to reinstate my lawsuit without prejudice. The attorney blinked. That's reasonable. They shook hands. Back in a courtroom, the terms were quickly outlined for the record. The judge, clearly impressed, nodded in approval. Mr. Carter, you've conducted yourself with integrity and intelligence today, the judge said. I hope you consider a future in the legal field. The court commends you. A few people in the gallery even clapped quietly. The same people who had once chuckled at Jamal were now witnessing something rare. A man who had been underestimated, overlooked, and nearly evicted, turned the law into his sword and shield. As Jamal gathered his papers and walked out of the courtroom, he wasn't just walking out as a tenant who had won his case. He was walking out as something far more powerful. A man who had learned how to defend his rights, and did it with such clarity, not even trained lawyers could outmatch him. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining. His daughter Nia was waiting on the steps, sitting with a neighbor who had watched her during the hearing. When she saw her dad, she jumped up and ran to him. Daddy, did we win? He picked her up, smiled, and whispered, We didn't just win, baby girl, we made them listen. The steps outside the courthouse had never felt so different. Jamal Carter stood in the sunlight, holding his daughter's hand, his folder now tucked tightly under his arm. He wasn't walking out with a fancy lawyer, and he didn't have a news crew waiting to capture the moment. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't in years. Pride. Not the pride that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from standing up when everyone expected you to fall. As people filtered out of the courtroom, a few stopped to speak to him. One woman, an older tenant who had been quietly watching from the back row, came up and said, I wish I had known what you knew when I went through the same thing. You gave us all hope today." Another man, a young law student who had been observing the case for his legal clinic, asked Jamal if he had legal training. "No," Jamal replied. "Just a library card, some late nights, and a reason not to give up." Inside the courtroom, the judge sat in silence for a moment after Jamal left. He stared at the empty chair where Jamal had made his case, not with a loud voice or fancy words, but with